by the St. Lawrence Seaway Project, and a quite excellent system of healthcare. It's not so good today because they are now in debt, but when it was first set up, it was done with this national credit. In 1974, they quit this practice and started borrowing on the private bond market, and that's when their debt shot up, and so today it's quite high. So why did they cease that practice? In 1974, the Basel Committee was set up by the central bank governors of the group of 10 countries of the BIS, and Canada joined in that year. And the goal of the Basel Committee was to maintain the stability of the currency, and basically what that meant was you couldn't inflate your currency, supposedly, by printing money or by borrowing from your own central bank, which printed money. You had to borrow on the private market. But so the implication of that was that when you borrow privately, you're borrowing existing money. But as we know, virtually all money is created by banks in the form of loans. They actually create money when they lend. The difference is that when a private bank lends the money to the government, they charge interest, and when the government borrows from its own central bank, it gets the interest back. And the problem with the whole interest system is that the banks create the principal, but they don't create the interest. So there's nowhere to get the interest except to borrow from somebody else, or for somebody else to go into debt. So you have this giant pyramid scheme where it takes more and more debt to sustain the system until it finally collapses. Obviously unsustainable. This is a chart that was put out by a group that was arguing that Medicare and Social Security, the entitlements, so-called entitlements, are what are killing us. But you can see that what is killing us is actually the interest. It's that big yellow triangle at the top. If we eliminated the interest, the federal debt would actually be quite sustainable. In fact, as has been previously argued here, we might not have a federal debt if we eliminated interest. And you can eliminate interest by borrowing from your own bank, and then you get the interest back. So borrowing from your own central bank. Right? Okay. The French, since 1973, have borrowed as much, or paid as much in interest as their debt is. So if they hadn't had to pay interest, they would have no debt. The Canadians have paid twice as much in interest as the debt now is, so they would have a nice surplus if they hadn't had to pay interest. In the U.S., the Federal Reserve only reports 24 years, but in the last 24 years, we taxpayers have paid $8.2 trillion in interest out of what was then a $15 trillion debt. So if you go all the way back to 1835, when the last time the debt was paid off, we might also not have a federal debt at all. We could, like the American colonists, eliminate income taxes if banking were a public utility, but I don't have time to go into the figures. Local governments could do the same thing. Even though they don't have the power to create money, they do have the power to have their own bank. If they borrowed from their own bank, they could borrow interest-free, and as Margaret Kennedy has argued, that means cutting the cost of your public projects by an average of 40%. We have but one bank that does that, one state that does this, North Dakota. The Bank of North Dakota was set up in 1919. It's the only state that escaped the credit crisis. It has the lowest unemployment rate in the country, the lowest foreclosure rate, and the lowest default rate on loans. But that's only one state. However, if you look globally, 40% of banks globally are publicly owned. And these are largely in the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, which also contain 40% of the global population. And those countries also escaped the credit crisis. They also have most of the global reserves, and they're not happy with the current reserve system under the US dollar. They want something else. In fact, the Chinese have proposed going back to Keynes's idea, which was basically a mutual credit clearing system, an international currency union where you'd be clearing trade balances not through somebody's reserve currency, but just by figuring out credits and debits. But then the question is, what would they use for a currency unit? Keynes proposed something called the banker, which would be based on a basket of commodities. Ross Jackson wrote a book called Occupy Wall Street, where he said that the problem with the basket of commodities is that commodities all rise and fall together, so it's not really a true measure of the value of the currency. Plus, it's really not relevant to what people need, goods and services that people actually use. Most people don't buy silver and gold. So he proposed a basket of currencies, but it seems to me that a basket of currencies is also sort of in flux. They're all valued against each other, so you still have this fluctuating ocean of prices. That's the reason we have this $1.5 quadrillion derivatives bubble, because everybody's trying to create some stability in this floating sea of exchange rates and interest rates and things that just aren't stable. Unlike the Sumerians, who fixed their interest rates for hundreds of years and fixed their prices for hundreds of years at a time. So then another possibility is green energy units, which has been discussed here. It seems to me the problem with that is that it is basically a commodity, even though it's a better commodity than gold, but it just seems to me a bit limiting. Doesn't really reflect the value of the currency. Another possibility is a consumer price index, but those are a bit manipulated. There are also indexes based on purchasing power parity that are quite sophisticated now. It seems to me that those might be the ideal measure of the value of the currency, a way to compare, to have a yardstick comparing the relative value of currencies that's not based on international speculation, that eliminates all those other factors that aren't relevant to the actual value of what the currency can buy in the economy. So if we did all that, we would be back to the mutual credit clearing system of the ancient Sumerians. And if credit were made a public utility, then interest and profits would go back to the public, and banking would become a sustainable system.
So thank you very much for your presentation, and particularly for the historical overview. It's very, let's say, interesting to realize that at one time, money has an old history, and certainly the movements along history and our recent history. So in particular, the colonial period that George mentioned from the UK and so forth. Fine. So thank you very much for that. So I got the information. Okay, that's fine. You are right, please. Yeah. That as I understand will be online in some 3/4 of an hour or some of that. So we have time to shift your presentation to Professor Oettgen. Introducing him is well known as Professor of Economy, has been director of the University of Wuppertal and of and as well as among others, Vice President of the European Academy for Science and Arts in Salzburg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have been asked to give some critical views on the concepts which are to be discussed today and tomorrow. And I must confess that the critical view will not be very strong on those concepts discussed here, with which I'm a bit familiar. For example, from the book of Stefan Brunhuber and other publications. So, for this reason, I will switch mainly on the global financial system, and here especially the role of the dollar, which is the unipolar currency system which dominates all national and continental currency systems, and my target will be that we have to switch from a unipolar currency system existing now and having been also in the 19th century anchored by the pound, the British pound, which is now the US dollar. We have to switch in the multipolar system, and then we get room also for regional or smaller complementary currency system, which otherwise would be, in most cases, be destroyed by the existing unipolar currency system. This is my thesis, and I will elaborate it a bit, starting from the fact that the existing unipolar financial market system is not only dominated by the US dollar, but it is also taken over by the European system of the euro, so that the cooperation between the US system and the European system is quite narrow, and they are both playing each other, but there is a predominance of the US currency system over the European system, which means that what happens actually in Europe is mainly the result of the system in the United States, and by dominating on global financial markets, the world financial system. So this is a critical view, because in many publications Europeans are criticized for not repairing their system without referring in most cases to the fact that the overswapping of the problems in the United States to Europe are really the background of the existing difficulties both in the private sector and in the state sector. So what results out of this, if we go to the multipolarity, is that Europe has to go out from a junior partnership with the dollar and to develop, if possible, and this will not be easy, to develop the European currency system going far beyond the existing, for example, the banking union, which is discussed now, but also the role of the national debt management and private banking management and so on. So the US model has come to the European economy not only in the financial sphere, but also in the state debt management, and additionally also in the private sector, in the productive sector. We have the well-known financial steering of productive activities, also in Europe, which is usual and adequate for the United States. So we had to go out more or less to be one counterpart in the multipolarity system in the future, and I will later on refer to Japan and to China. So the origins of the existing global financial system comes out from the Bretton Woods system, where the United States has very much contributed to the reconstruction of Europe, and Europe's have to be very grateful for this help after the Second World War, which was also at the advantage for the United States for creating jobs for the soldiers coming back in the United States, because the demand resulting from Europe, from the help of the Marshall Plan mainly, the demand for US products was a very important help also for the United States, both for Europe. So it was the transatlantic cooperation which was very well functioning. This is